Hi everyone. Statutory Instrument number 296 of 2020 comes into operation today. This statutory instrument makes it a criminal offence to enter certain premises and businesses unless you can avail of one of the government mandated excuses referred to in this legislation as a reasonable excuse. Now, many of you may be familiar with Statutory Instrument number 244 of 2020, which mandates the wearing of face coverings on public transport. At the outset of this video, I wish to say that the legislation with regards to face covering in shops is not as severe as with regard to face coverings on public transport. In my view, this is the result of kickback from members of the public with regard to the unjust erosion of their rights. So please do not assume you must comply with this legislation, because if you feel any distress in wearing a face covering, you are not legally required to wear one, arising from this legislation in shops. So what does the regulation say? The regulation is broken into 5 parts as follows. Part 1 outlines the date of commencement being today, the 10th of August 2020. Part 2 confirms that this regulation will remain in force until the 5th of October 2020, noting that this is the same date that the legislation with regard to face coverings on public transport is due to expire. I have said this many times already, but remember that the legislation which legalised the lockdown initially had an operation period of only 4 days. And many of the other COVID statutory instruments have all been extended well past their initial dates of operation where applicable. So do not take anything for granted as regards expiry dates stated on any of the COVID statutory instruments, including this one. Part 3 is the definition section. This section defines what is meant by a face covering and includes a covering of any type which, when worn by a person, covers the person's nose and mouth. Part 3 also defines what a relevant premises is. This definition is important as a relevant premises is a premises you may not enter or remain in without wearing a face covering. A relevant premises under this regulation is stated to be an indoor premises to which the public has access and includes A. Where goods and services are sold, so this is the catch-all provision. B. That is specified in Part A of the schedule. Part A includes shopping centres, libraries, cinemas, theatres, concert halls, bingo halls and museums. And C, in which a service specified in Part B of the schedule is carried out. Part B includes cosmetic nail care or nail styling, hair care or hair styling, tattoo and piercing services, travel agents and tour operators, laundries and dry cleaners and licensed bookmakers. The definition for relevant premises also states that the following are not considered relevant premises under this regulation. A post office, credit union or bank. A premises where the principal activity is the sale of food or beverages for consumption on the premises, or a premises in which the principal activity is the provision of medical or dental services or other healthcare services, but not including the likes of pharmacies, opticians or outlets providing or selling hearing aids or test services. Part 4 deals with the requirement to wear a face covering and states that a person shall not, without reasonable excuse, we will look at the definition for reasonable excuse shortly, enter or remain in a relevant premises. We know from the definition section that a relevant premises means any indoor premises where goods are sold directly to the public, so all shops, hardware stores, pharmacies, off licenses, etc. And also the likes of shopping centres, cinemas, libraries, nail salons, hairdressers, tattoo parlours, dry cleaners, but excluding the likes of banks, credit unions, post offices, or pubs and restaurants where you are permitted and intend to consume food or beverages on the premises. In a relevant geographical location, which under Statutory Instrument number 120 of 2020, we know to mean the entire state of Ireland, without wearing a face covering, which, as we confirmed earlier, means any type of face covering that covers the nose and mouth. However, this requirement does not apply to the following groups of people. A person under the age of 13. B, a responsible person who under this legislation is the occupier, manager or any other person in charge of a relevant premises, or a worker, but only where there is a screen that separates the responsible person or worker, or where they have taken all reasonable steps to maintain a distance of at least 2 metres from themselves and other persons. Or C, a member of the Garda Síochána in the course of performing their duties. It is important to note that the requirement to wear a face covering within a relevant premises, so any shop described above, unless you have a reasonable excuse, is stated to be a penal provision, meaning that if you fail to comply with this part of the regulation, you may be arrested and incur a fine of up to €2,500 or 6 months imprisonment. The next section, part 4.4, is interesting, as this is the most drastic divergence from the law under the public transport regulation. Part 4.4 states that a responsible person, so this is the occupier, manager, or any other person in charge of a relevant premises, note that this does not include a general worker, is required to engage with persons entering or in the relevant premises, so in the shop, to inform them of the requirement to wear a face covering and to promote their compliance. So under this regulation, there is no legal authority for you, number one, to be stopped by a random worker in a shop, as the person questioning you must be the occupier, the manager, or a person in charge of the shop. And two, the responsible person is only required to inform you as to the requirement to wear a face covering and promote, which means to actively encourage you to wear a face covering. The stark contrast between this regulation and the regulation with regards to public transport is that under the public transport regulation, the person questioning you had the right to request the passenger to wear a face covering, refuse the passenger entry to a public transport vehicle, or request the passenger to alight from a public transport vehicle. However, before exercising any such power, the relevant person was required to give the passenger an opportunity to provide their reasonable excuse. However, under the public transport regulation, the passenger was required to provide such information as the relevant person considered necessary to determine whether or not the passenger had in fact a reasonable excuse. It was this specific provision within the public transport regulation that gave rise to the concern, and rightly so, that a GP or similar letter would be required if a passenger did not intend to wear a face covering on public transport. This current regulation 296 of 2020 gives no such authority to a responsible person to inquire as to the nature of your reasonable excuse. This is very important, and I'll discuss shortly how I propose you interact with a responsible person in the event that you are questioned for not wearing a face covering in shops. Part 5 is likely the section that people will have most interest in, as this section sets out the reasonable excuses that persons in the state of Ireland may avail of as an exemption from the requirement to wear a face covering in shops and other relevant premises. Under this regulation, a reasonable excuse includes the following. A, the person cannot put on, wear or remove a face covering. Number one, because of any physical or mental illness, impairment or disability, or two, without severe distress. Personally, this is the exemption that I, and I believe most people, will probably avail of. B, the person needs to communicate with a person who has difficulties communicating in relation to speech, language or otherwise. C, the person removes the face covering to provide emergency assistance or to provide care or assistance to a vulnerable person. D, the person removes the face covering to avoid harm or injury or the risk of harm or injury. E, the person removes the face covering in order to and only for the time required to take medication. F, the person removes the face covering at the request of a responsible person or a worker in order to ascertain the age of the person where there is a minimum age requirement with regard to the provision of goods and services. G, the person removes the face covering at the request of the responsible person or a worker in order to assist them in providing him or her with healthcare or healthcare advice. So to recap, from today, all persons except children under the age of 13 years and those with a reasonable excuse are required, in order to enter or remain within a shop and other premises, to wear a face covering. And a reasonable excuse may include physical illness, impairment or disability, such as asthma, being prone to respiratory infections, weakened immune systems, etc., or persons who feel distressed by having to wear a face covering. Also, as stated earlier, the occupier, owner or person in charge of a shop or other relevant premises must inform you, the customer, of the requirement to wear a face covering and encourage your compliance. There is no permission set out in this regulation to eject you from the premises for failure to wear a face covering. However, as failure to wear a face covering without a reasonable excuse is a criminal offence, the reasonable person is well within their rights to call the Gardaí to advise them that you are breaking the law by not wearing a face covering. Therefore, I would suggest that if you intend to avail of one of the reasonable excuses, you present a self-declaration to the responsible person and advise them that you are exempt from the requirement to wear a face covering. Given the manner in which this regulation has been drafted, I believe that such a self-declaration will be sufficient to ensure your entry into a relevant premises without incident. That said, while you may know the law in this area, there is a very good chance that the person questioning you will not know the law in this area. So you should be mindful of this, and I would also suggest that you bring a copy of this regulation with you when you go to the shops until such time as those in charge of shops become familiar with the rights of customers to claim an exemption. For the sake of completeness, I have drafted a self-declaration that you may use, and I have included this in the description box below. You should also be aware that under the Equal Status Acts 2000 to 2012, it is illegal to discriminate a person in relation to the provision of goods and services on one of the protected grounds, which includes disability. The reason I reference this is because in the event that a shop states that their own internal policies are in excess of the law set out under Statutory Instrument 296 of 2020, and if they state that they do not permit entry into their premises without a face covering, regardless of the exemptions under the law, you may refer them to the Equal Status Acts, which likely makes their behaviour illegal in the event that your reasonable excuse may amount to a disability. I, for one, will not be wearing a face covering, given that there is no medical or scientific data to support their use, or simply to appease government or other members of the public. And I certainly do not intend to accept the erosion of my freedoms as being the new normal. That said, I and others who value freedom do not draw any conclusion from those who choose to wear face coverings. The reason I say this is because we value your right to choose what is right for you. What we take issue with is laws and rules which mandate our compliance with the erosion of our freedoms. I will be attending the Time for Change protest on the 22nd of August 2020 because I disagree with being forced to wear a face covering in order to participate in society. And I am extremely fearful that the next step to realising the new normal will be mandatory vaccinations. If you share this concern or simply wish to express general disagreement with the use of force and coercion on the part of the Irish government, or wish to assert and reclaim your constitutional rights, civil liberties and freedom to choose, please join me as a concerned citizen at 2 p.m. on the 22nd of August 2020 outside Custom House in Dublin. Thanks for listening.